Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Joe White. I'm the UK's tech envoy to the United States and Consul General here in San Francisco. And thank you for tuning in to this important conversation on climate in this pivotal year as we head towards COP26 and the commitments that we'll make there today and for the future. This is important to me, given the UK is hosting COP26 this year in Glasgow, and we're joined by Alok Sharma, the COP president designate on the UK side, but also being based here in Silicon Valley at the heart of the global tech ecosystem. And we have great companies like Google and Salesforce with us today as well. Really, the opportunity to join the government and the tech industry is one of the main threads that we can seek to solve this climate crisis. But you don't have to be a billion-dollar company to take part in this. In fact, the ecosystems all over the world and entrepreneurs and startups are working on these kind of issues. And we're grateful to Planet, who helped convene this today, provide global image mapping and geospatial data to help us really monitor what's happening within the climate environment. So without further ado, please enjoy the rest of the discussion today, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this esteemed panel of leaders gathered today to talk about climate action, Silicon Valley, and the road to COP26. My name is Trish Wilson. I'm the Climate and Environment Editor at the Washington Post. It is likely we will look back at 2021 as the most critical year in the fight against climate change. It's the year when the attitude and the conversation worldwide changed, when we really had public expectations and global attention to limit the impacts of global warming. And the question before us is, will we use that awareness and willingness to take action effectively, or will we fail? 2021 is a pivotal year, marking a sea change in how we deal with climate change. We know the planet has warmed more than 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution. We know greenhouse gas emissions are trapping the planet's heat, and we know how to stop global warming. Will we? To avoid catastrophic temperature rise, we must cut our carbon emissions in half by 2030. Around the planet, companies, cities, and communities are setting ambitious targets. Global financial markets are beginning to drive material decarbonization, and the world is gearing up for the most important climate negotiations of this decade in Glasgow, Scotland, at COP26. Cutting emissions will require a transformational change across almost every sector of the global economy, including energy, transportation, agriculture, industry, construction, finance, and land use. None of this will be possible without digital technologies, new platforms, and new applications in areas like internet connectivity, advanced broadband, remote sensing, data science and artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and enterprise software. In countless ways, digital transformation will drive the sustainability revolution. The overarching question before us is, how do we best align these powerful tools to address the rapidly growing climate challenge? Is the immense power of Silicon Valley pointed at climate action? When we look back at 2021, it is the panelists here before us whose names will be in the history books. Thank you all very much for joining our discussion, which is hosted by Planet, the private data and satellite firm based in San Francisco. Our panelists today are Mark Benioff, Chair, CEO and founder of Salesforce, the global cloud computing company; Katherine Hayhoe, climate scientist, chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy, and a UN champion of the Earth; Will Marshall, CEO and co-founder of Planet, the global daily satellite company; Sundar Pichai, CEO of Google and Alphabet; and Alok Sharma, president of the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, known as COP26, and member of the UK Cabinet. Dr. Hayhoe, let's get started. How bad is climate change? How much time do we have? And what do we need to do?
Well, the best way to put it is this: we are conducting a truly unprecedented experiment with the only home that we have. Climate is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. And we know that what we've seen so far is just a small part of what's already in the pipeline. Because as far back as we can go, millions of years, we have never seen so much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. It used to be that this was a future issue, but we can see the impacts right now here today. We can see wildfires burning greater area, heat waves becoming more frequent and more deadly, hurricanes stronger and more damaging, Sea level rising, floods increasing, droughts getting stronger. The impacts are already here today. So if that's the case, why aren't we acting? A big part of what holds us back is our fear of change. Many people feel like there aren't any solutions that will actually give us a better future. And of course, there are, and that's what this panel is all about.
That's right. Do you think that we still have hope of limiting warming to 1.5 C by 2100?
There is no magic threshold that will avoid all of the impacts because some of them are already here today. It's like there's no magic number of cigarettes you can smoke without incurring any lung damage. As if you could smoke, 9,999, and then as long as you don't smoke that last one, everything's okay. It's the same way with carbon emissions. Each gigaton of carbon emissions we produce carries with it a cost. And so the reality is, the faster we cut our emissions, the better off we'll all be. 1.5 degrees is a lot better than 1.7. 1.7 is better than 1.8. 1.8 is better than 2, but no matter what we do, our action will benefit us all, both here today as well as in the future. Because what we often don't realize is that burning fossil fuels does not only produce the heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around our planet, causing it to warm. Burning fossil fuels also produces much of the air pollution that we breathe in, that scientists estimate is responsible for an astounding and astonishing nearly 9 million premature deaths around the world per year.
Alok, you're about to gather representatives from almost 200 countries in Glasgow, Scotland in November to get them to agree on cutting their greenhouse gas emissions. 3 of your fellow panelists are among the most important Silicon Valley leaders. If you could have whatever you wanted out of Silicon Valley to save the planet, what would you ask them for?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on this panel. I think that's a great question. I think it'd be quite useful just to set out what it is that we're trying to achieve on the road to net Glasgow. And I think the overarching message that we want to come out of Glasgow is that we collectively, world leaders, came together and we did our part to keep that 1.5 degree goal within reach. And we've heard that was a sort of key part of the Paris Agreement, and that is what we want to see happen, to keep 1.5 alive. And the way we're doing that is I'm giving a consistent message to all governments. First, we want them to come forward and reduce their emissions, give ambitious targets to reduce their near-term emissions by 2030, and then actually also commit to going to net zero by the middle of the century. Secondly, as we've just heard, climate change is happening around us, so we want countries to set out their plans for adapting to the climate change that's already happening. Thirdly, there are elements of the Paris Agreement that are still outstanding. The Paris Agreement as a framework, an overarching framework, was arrived at in 2015, but there are some areas like carbon markets which are still outstanding, so we need to agree those detailed rules. And finally, and this for me is incredibly vital, is finance. So both public and private finance to drive investment into climate resilient infrastructure. So what do we want from the private sector, from the folks who are represented here? The first thing to say is that I really do believe that technology is going to be a key part of delivering those emission reductions, and we're seeing that already. If you look at the energy sector, for instance, in the last 10 years, the price of solar has come down by over 80%. The price of wind power come down by 50%. And this is what is also then driving forward that clean energy transition. So just as that's happened in the energy sector, we need this to happen across a whole range of sectors. And we've got technology now, which ultimately needs to be put to scale, needs to be commercialized. I'm talking about things like hydrogen, carbon capture, storage, energy storage. All of that is going to be vital. So what is it that the folks on this panel can do? Well, firstly, they can help and invest in those sectors. They can help to make sure that they're taking part in public-private partnerships to help scale up these technologies that we need. And I think there's a separate point about data. So if we look at the sort of things that we want to try and do to prevent deforestation, to have a sustainable agriculture, that actually requires the use of data, satellite imagery. And I think what would be great is if we could get to a point where this was provided transparently, it was freely available, particularly for developing countries, which would allow them to plan not only to ensure that they were tackling the impacts of climate change, but also to be able to track it.
Do you think that the whole system of using carbon markets is still in play?
Well, Article 6, of course, has to be resolved. That's one of the key outstanding elements of the Paris Rulebook. Obviously, in relation to COP26, we have a whole range of mandates that we have to get through. And Article 6, as I said, is part of this. There's a wider discussion, of course, about carbon leakage in the market. There's a wider discussion about emissions trading schemes, about CBAMs. All of that is out there. But in relation to COP26, obviously what we want to try and do is resolve Article 6, because that is what we are mandated to do.
Understood. For Sundar and Mark, you are both CEOs of some of the world's most significant companies and already have shed your corporate carbon footprints, or are trying to. Both of your companies are driving hard for a carbon-free future, which is no small feat given how large you are. How do you think your companies, Google and Salesforce, ought to be helping the world with climate change? What do you think that you should be doing beyond what you're doing within your own companies and on your own campuses?
Mark, you want to go first?
Mark.
Well, I strongly believe business is the greatest platform for change. And I completely agree with the comments that have been made that we are in the middle of a climate emergency and that all of us need to pivot all of our resources to address probably one of the most audacious goals we've ever had on this planet, which is to lower emissions dramatically, but also sequester the over 100 gigatons of carbon that has been emitted since the first industrial revolution, and the 600 million gigatons of carbon that has been emitted through the 3 million acres of deforestation, 3 trillion acres of deforestation that we've already experienced on the planet. We have a tremendous situation right now where we must look at how are we going to energize people like we're about to hear from Will Marshall, Planet Labs, but other ecopreneurs. How can we energize these ecopreneurs to help us sequester this carbon? This is absolutely critical for us. And we're at a moment now where we can look at models that companies like Google and Salesforce have pioneered in Silicon Valley, entrepreneurial companies. We need ecopreneurs. And these ecopreneurs can do 4 things. 1, they can help us to lower carbon emissions. That's critical. That's number 1. Step 1, reduce emissions. 2, sequester. There's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere right now. I know that because if you look at the Keeling curve, you can see it just goes up and to the right. That means that we have a lot of work to do to get that carbon out of the atmosphere. And we have a lot of technology on the planet to do that already. The number 1 of those is the tree. That's why we came up with 1 trillion trees, because we can sequester that carbon. 3, we can provide a lot more education. There's a lot of things that just businesses and consumers can do to reduce their carbon footprint and become net zero, like companies like Salesforce and Google already are. And 4, we can also do a lot of innovation. And when you hear Will Marshall speak or many other ecopreneurs, you realize that we're really on, I think, the threshold of one of the greatest moments of innovation in the world, and it's going to be in this area of the environment. So if we can do these things, we can address this crisis and we can save our planet.
Okay, let's hope for that. Sundar, Google announced a goal recently of running a carbon-free 24/7 operation. How are you doing at achieving that?
Well, Trish, great to be here. And I think everyone here has captured why this is the biggest risk we face. And, at Google, we view big risks as a challenge, as an opportunity. And when I heard Minister Sharma mention trying to get commitments by 2030, we have one of the boldest commitments out there as Google, as a company. We've been carbon neutral since 2007. And, Mark spoke about the innovation that's happening. To put it in perspective, we made a big bet on wind and solar when the costs were very high, but we bet on that technology curve. And so the stats of the cost having come down 80% over the last decade for solar, 50% by wind, is what has actually allowed us. We've eliminated our entire carbon legacy. That early bet on wind and solar paid off. And it also helps catalyze other such investments. So we are doing something similar now again. So by 2030, we have committed to be 24/7 carbon free. That is every hour, every day, around the world. So every email people use in Gmail or every query they type in search, we want to serve it without using carbon at all. It's a moonshot. It stresses me out in terms of how to get there. But again, you bet on technology and innovation. For example, just like we did with wind and solar, we have started betting on geothermal now. We have one of the biggest new geothermal projects underway in Nevada for our data center. And we have to solve how to store energy, how do we think beyond wind and solar and geothermal in places which don't have access to that? How do we offset our load across the world? But these are bold bets, and we think of these as moonshots. And I'm excited about not just doing it for Google, but bringing it out through Google Cloud to our partners around the world as well. So really excited about that.
So when you think about what Google can do beyond Google's the company, what do you think about? Because what we're talking about is transformational change in everyone's daily life, right? Everybody's got to go through something as intense as, wait for it, staying at home for a year in a lockdown due to a pandemic, right? It's going to be that's how different. And if anybody knows how to do transformational change, I think it's pretty much the digital people in Silicon Valley, right? So what do you see that you can do, that you all can do to help us get to this next place that we so desperately need to go?
I think great question, and I think a common thread that drives all of us here. When Mark is talking about deforestation and trees, I think the efforts he's driving are not just for what Salesforce can do, but how do you catalyze, an ecosystem around it and get others to do it as well. We think about it the same way. So pretty much everything we are doing, we want to bring it outside. So for example, DeepMind, which is based in the UK, figured out how we can run our data centers more efficient for cooling by 30% using AI. We are providing that as a solution through Google Cloud. Billions of users use our products. So we are designing not just in our products to help people have better behavior when it comes to climate choices. And we think we can influence it a lot. In MAP, we are now, where possible, trying to default and give the most eco-friendly route as the default driving direction. Mm-hmm. Simple choices like this can unlock, tremendously. We are using AI in many ways. We are forecasting floods better, and we are deploying it in places like India and Bangladesh. We are trying to simulate weather better, so better predict weather events, adverse weather events, so that people can plan for it better. And, so there are countless examples like that. But I think it's important across all of us. We are not solving it just for ourselves, but we are building platforms. Minister Sharma mentioned the data use. I think maybe Will can talk about, Planet, bringing satellite data. I think that's another example of how we can use what we have to catalyze change across.
Well, Will, that leads us to you. What do you think of the answers that you're hearing from your fellow panelists? Do you think we're on the right path? Do you think this path are we moving quickly enough? Do we have enough time to do what needs to be done? I mention this because emissions are still going up, right?
No, I don't think we're doing enough. So, I obviously everyone here is trying hard and very committed. But I'm glad we're talking about action because biodiversity loss and climate change are in a state of emergency, and we have to take action. So there's no question we have to act now. And the way I see it is that we build spacecraft, and actually the Earth is a big spaceship hurtling around the sun with 7 billion astronauts on it, and it has sensitive ecological and climatic systems. And we have to monitor those systems. Actually, when you build spacecraft, you have to monitor the spacecraft really rapidly. Otherwise, problems happen that you can't fix. It's the same thing for our whole spaceship of the Earth. We have to monitor it really regularly. And that's where our data comes in. Planet images the whole Earth landmass every day with about 200 satellites. And I hope that with that, we can help see some of these changes and help accelerate, to your question, are we doing enough? Not enough, no. Help accelerate some of these changes, because you can't manage what you can't measure. So we work with, just give you a couple of examples. We work with Climate Trace, this new consortium of NGOs that's trying to track all the countries' emissions. Al Gore's pushing this initiative, and one of those NGOs, Carbon Tracker, is using our data to monitor all the coal power plants around the world and monitor the decommissioning and check it's on track according to the regulation. So it's helping the regulators take action. Another example is with Norway, that is paid for our data to be accessible for tracking deforestation across the 64 tropical countries. So from Brazil to Congo to Indonesia, and get that data out to everyone, partially via digital public good. And our data can just about see every tree in all those countries. And every day we can monitor if there's any deforestation and help those forestry ministries, as well as NGOs on the ground, help track and stop deforestation, again, to help climate action. So I hope our data set can help accelerate some of these actions and bring transparency and a degree of independence, because satellite data is, of course, immediately global to some of these challenges to help that acceleration. I mean, Planet is pretty much set up to try and help this transition of the global economy as much as we can.
What do you think, Catherine? When you hear these plans, what's your reaction?
Well, so often we think of climate solutions as being difficult and expensive and worse than what we have today. And that's a big part of what's holding us back. But I love, like what Sunder said, their goal is to make every Gmail carbon free. So people don't have to think about it when they send an email. It just automatically is. We need electric cars or public transportation to be the easiest thing to do. You have to go out of your way to find an internal combustion engine and where to put gas in it. We need solutions. We need a big red, green, easy button for people. Green, not red. Because we are looking at the biggest societal transformation, and we have to bring everybody along with us, regardless of whether they understand the urgency of it or not. And we can do that by making those solutions better. And that's why I'm so excited to hear everything that we've been hearing, because that is what Silicon Valley can do. They can make the solutions easier. They can make them accessible to everyone, whether they're conscious of it or not. And they can make those solutions lead us to a world that is actually better than the one we have today, not worse.
Alok, do you think that that's the sort of thing that people understand in terms of what you are dealing with as you try to get these almost 200 countries to agree on cutting their emissions? Do you think that the hope and the possibility and the cheapness, so to speak, of climate solutions are known?
I think countries particularly are starting to understand this. I've just returned from Southeast Asia, and there are a range of countries there that are clearly expanding their economies at a rapid pace. They also need to expand their energy needs. And the discussion they have to have right now is that, do they go through fossil fuels? Do they go the coal route? Or do they go renewables and solar? And I think what they're understanding actually is that not just from an environmental perspective, but also from the perspective of costs, it's better to go down the renewables route. So I think people are absolutely understanding this. And, I'm sort of cautiously optimistic that, working together, but it will require, by the way, not just governments, but obviously business, civil society, all of us working together. If I said to you that when we started our presidency process, when we were told we were going to be the president of COP26, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at 70%. And so, you do see change. Of course, we need those near-term emission reduction targets as well to go with the longer-term commitments. But I think there is a growing realization. And I have to say that the work that I'm doing, every country I visit, I meet civil society, I meet youth groups, and I think they are a really powerful force. I think for them to be saying to business, for saying to governments, you have to act, particularly young people, because it's their future that we are dealing with. The decisions that the leadership right now makes are going to have the biggest impact on the young generation and the future generation. So we owe it to them to get this right.
Mm-hmm. When I was talking to Will earlier today and his colleagues, they were talking about what people are doing, young people, when they're coming out of college, and what are they working on if they're in Silicon Valley, and do they have the opportunity to do meaningful work to help the planet, or are they still doing, apps for cats and other kinds of, not what we exactly need? So my question is for Sundar and Mark, do you think that we're reaching young people? Do you think they understand that there is such a thing as an ecopreneur, that there are companies like Planet that are actually in the climate change business, that there are huge opportunities before us to grab this world and help fix it? Do you all think that is something that these kids know?
I definitely feel that there are many reasons why as Silicon Valley companies, we do what we do. It's a foundational value. But one practical reason we all do it is we all want to hire the best talent out there. And bar none, when you look at the next generation coming in, this is, the issue they care the most about. And you feel that across the board. When I go to my kids' schools, it is a bigger topic of conversation than ever before. And Alok was saying this too. I think the change you feel is palpable. It's the next generation is impatient, and they're going to hold us increasingly accountable. And I think, we all need to respond to that. And, it's great to see that.
Trish, can I just come in very briefly on this point? So I think Sundar's absolutely right. And, 6 months to go to COP26, I gave a speech in Glasgow. And I asked my daughters who are one's 21, one's 19, and I said to them, what's the one message you want me to convey to world leaders in the speech? And they said, just simply tell them, pick the planet. And that actually is the message, I think, that is coming from young people across the world. That's what they want. They want us to pick the planet. They want us to ensure the policies we're putting in place leave a cleaner, greener future for them. And actually, it is possible. You can have economic growth at the same time as cutting emissions. Countries around the world have shown it. We've shown it in the UK. We just need to act.
Well, Mark, you were going to say something about bringing on young people, and do you agree that they all know they're all ready? Do they have the opportunities to do the fixing that they expect us to fix?
Well, the World Economic Forum has built an incredible community called Uplink. Uplink is kind of a place where ecopreneurs, that is, entrepreneurs who are working on ecology, working on the planet, coming up with these innovative solutions that are going to help us solve these problems, can go. Salesforce built it for them with Deloitte. Today, there's over 10,000 of those entrepreneurs in that community. I'll give you an example. I just invested in one of those entrepreneurs that I found on the forums, a company called NCX, based in Berkeley, California. They use artificial intelligence to quantify biodiversity and allow landowners to make money. It's very simple. The landowner identifies their parcel, says, I have this 1,000 or 2,000 acres of forest, but I've been having to actually chop down those trees to make money on a regular basis. Well, I'm not going to chop those trees down. I'm going to preserve them. I'm going to conserve them. That's a critical part of this solution. And they're able to make that connection then with corporations who are able to then absorb that as carbon credits. That's really a carbon market, right? You have the landowners, they have the carbon, they have the trees. Now they're preserving the trees. And then you have corporations who are able to say, oh, I'm able to receive those carbon credits, and AI makes it possible. But it's really the ecopreneur that made it possible. It was the application, ncx.com, and this small company right now, less than 100, entrepreneurial type people, like the way, Sundar and I used to be, working on building their product and getting their company going. And it's very exciting. And that idea that there could be an ecopreneur, that's new in and of itself. We didn't talk about ecopreneurship just a few years ago. And so that gives me hope. That gives me optimism, because it's about the youth, it's about innovation, and it's about ideas, and it's about entrepreneurship. And those are the models that we've seen that can make a dramatic difference for the future.
Thank you. Well, Will, you have a great story about building a company out of, what was it I heard, a bunch of guys or people in a garage with hoodies and aspirations, and that's it, 10 years ago. And today you have a remarkable company. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you started and what your mission is and what makes you different? What makes you a climate company and not just a private data analytics satellite company?
There's no planet B. You know, we have to work on this planet, and we were space geeks thinking, how can we help with the world's challenges? What can we do to most impact them? And we looked actually at what was then the Millennium Development Goals and said, what can we do with satellites that would most help all of those? And I think increasingly we'll see entrepreneurs do that sort of thing. They'll go, what are the challenges of the world? What are the Sustainable Development Goals, like my pin here? Or what are the COP goals? And how do we tackle them? I hope our data set will help us to all those ecopreneurs to work. I mean, like the one that Mark just mentioned, you know, we hope to help them with that carbon economy, and there's many others. There's thousands of little ones that we would like to help support with data set, because again, you can't manage it if you don't measure it. And one thing, I mean, just in the future, I hope that we'll get better and better at doing those satellites data. Gets better and better data. So one thing we just announced in the sort of run up to COP, a new set of satellites that we're going to launch called Carbon Mapper, which is going to be a fleet of satellites doing hyperspectral imaging over 400 spectral bands. And that enables us to detect methane and carbon dioxide sources directly, and to see if there's on that oil, on that gas pipeline, if there's a leak, or if there's too much coming from that agricultural facility or that waste dump, and that we need to control it. And this is a consortium with some NGOs and NASA JPL instrument. We're building the satellites, and the California Air Resources Board, which pioneers environmental regulation here in California, it's a consortium to all come together to make that happen. And so, you know, and I also hope that we can do more in making all this data set accessible. And that's actually where Sundar mentioned the flood modeling work that is done. And some of that's using our data to look at Bangladesh and India, and after the monsoon season, use 2 of our satellites taking pictures at different angles to create a 3-dimensional model just after the monsoon season. The floodplain changes, and our satellites are able to remodel them to see where the floods are going to go for the next season, so that you can then make sure you're not building infrastructure in the floodplain or things like that. And so we hopefully with more and better data and better systems of machine learning and artificial intelligence to understand those data, we can help empower all those entrepreneurs or ecopreneurs, as Mark puts it.
Well, you know, I hear you, and I was just thinking about what you said about methane. Can you explain why is methane skyrocketing right now? I know a lot of scientists and others have been wondering what's going on with this methane jump. Do you understand what's happening?
For the most part, we've been having methane leaks for a long time. We just haven't known where they are. And so NASA JPL recently did this California Airborne Observatory with this hyperspectral instrument just to look for all the methane leaks, and found loads of them. And then we were like, oh dear. And now what we're doing is taking that instrument and flying in space so that we can regularly monitor all of those emissions across the whole globe. But there are some ways in which it's rapidly increasing, and particularly in the permafrost. As it melts, you release pockets of methane. We're also looking in Siberia and northern Canada and the other places where these happen, and trying to see what we can do about that. But I would turn it to Catherine, who is far more knowledgeable than me on methane. What do you say to that question? Is there much more methane now?
Well, methane has been increasing along with carbon dioxide since the dawn of the industrial era. And in fact, that was the topic of a lot of my graduate work, is looking at methane specifically. Why? Because it is 35 times stronger than carbon dioxide. Thankfully, we haven't produced as much of it. So methane's only responsible for just under 20% of this extra blanket we've wrapped around the planet. But methane comes from a lot of human sources. It comes from natural gas leaks, because natural gas is mostly methane. That's what it's made up of. It comes from the decay of organic material. So all of the food waste in rich countries, we waste about 40 or 50% of the food we produce. As it decays, it produces methane. We have methane coming out of wastewater treatment plants. We have methane coming out of rice paddies. And as you pointed out, Will, and this is really important, as the world warms, previously frozen ground in the Arctic is thawing. And as it thaws, all of the organic material in that ground thaws too, and it produces methane too. So it isn't only about carbon. It's about all of the heat trapping gases that we're producing. We have to eliminate those emissions in order to stabilize our climate. And working with nature rather than against nature is a huge part of the way that we can do that. So we've been tracking atmospheric methane levels for decades. So we scientists have a great idea of what's happening in the atmosphere, but we didn't realize, we knew that some of it was coming from methane leaks from natural gas, but we didn't realize just how much until the satellites got in on it. And it is horrifying. So here in West Texas, where I live, they leak enough natural gas, which like I said, is mostly methane, to power almost all the homes in Texas. That's how much they're just leaking into the atmosphere. So not only is it wasteful, because if you burn it, it produces CO2, which is at least less powerful than methane. Not only is it wasteful, but it's directly contributing to accelerating climate change, which is the exact opposite of where we need to be going.
Yeah, and this is exactly the kind of place where technology can come in, because now we have the tools to pinpoint those sources and then go and stop it, right? Can we stop that leak from that old oil and gas facility or from that waste dump or what have you? And so that's hopefully where we can bring us into a new era of rapidly fixing. When humans create problems, we rapidly fix them, at least.
We just heard the dialogue of why we have to reduce methane and carbon. But we don't actually know where the methane is. This is the first time in human history that we're actually going to be able to actually identify where the methane is when the carbon mapper satellite actually launches. So that is the kind of innovation we need. It's a great example. Here's a great ecopreneur, Will Marshall. Here's an amazing company, Planet. Here's an amazing product, carbon mapper. Here goes the satellite. And now the satellite says, oh, look, here's where the methane is. And then we can take action. But today we can all say, oh, we need to reduce methane, but we don't have some magic wand that we can actually go do that easily. We can say, oh, we need new kinds of, biomes for cows. That could be one thing we're doing. But what about everything that's going on right now? And this is why I think it's so exciting to highlight the work of Planet and also so many other ecopreneurs who are going to really get us to where we're going.
Well, speaking of taking on new challenges, can you tell us something about what is going on with your own ocean initiative and whether or not, and the trillion trees, and whether you're learning anything from these initiatives?
Well, the Ocean Initiative, which has been going on for quite a few years, it is really all about, well, how do we save the oceans? And we know there's so many challenges in the oceans. Like, we know that we have to get the plastic out of the ocean. We have a serious crisis there. We could talk about that. We know that we have coral bleaching issues. We know we have acidification issues. We know that we have overfishing issues. But the number one thing in the ocean is too much carbon in the atmosphere. Because there's so much carbon in the atmosphere and because the world is getting hotter, that is causing a dramatic amount of the change in the ocean. So that's really what brought me to 1 trillion trees, if you want to hear my crazy story, which is I didn't know anything about ecology. I'm a software guy from San Francisco, but all of a sudden I love the ocean. I just love the ocean. And then all of a sudden I realized, oh, the ocean's getting hotter. We need a way to sequester all that carbon. We have this great technology, the tree. Now we're like, we need 1 trillion trees. That's 200 gigatons of carbon. That would make a dramatic difference on the planet if we planted 1 trillion trees. We already have commitments for almost 100 billion trees. This is an incredible initiative now led by the World Economic Forum, supported by the United States government, European governments, and others. This is a moment in time that we need to actually put the light on the tree. This is something we can all do. We can rally people. People want to know, what can I do? You can plant a tree.
Sundar, what do you think? What are your thoughts as you listen to people talking about the future, about what's before us, and about these initiatives and whether they can make a difference?
Look, I'm excited because we are looking at the problem in, thinking with an engineering mind. I love the fact that we are looking at the problem many different ways, understanding the key drivers. I see journalists, I see policymakers, I see scientists, and I see the private sector, the ecopreneur ecosystem coming together. So I'm optimistic. One example maybe I would add on to it is we are now working with 500 cities around the world. 50% of the world's population lives in cities. Cities account for 70% of the emissions. And again, similar to the methane problem, there's just very poor data. And so we've committed to helping 500 cities reduce 1 gigaton of emissions annually by 2030. And to do that, we've started in Copenhagen and London. We are mapping air pollution street by street, and working, building a sensor network, capturing the data, and giving city planners and governments that data back. You'd be surprised at how much variation in air quality between streets and cities can vary by almost 800%. And there are, again, sources, people, we are just beginning to understand what all is going on. And I think we are in that moment. And so to me, from an engineering technology standpoint, once you understand, obviously you can impact it because, the system responds to that. So I'm really excited about all this.
Well, maybe there is hope. Before we close, can I hear from all of you what you think are some of the most, the most exciting initiative that you've heard about?
It's hard to pick one because I go out and I look for hope. It doesn't come to meet you. It doesn't come to find you. You have to go out and you have to look for those stories. And when I do, I am absolutely inspired. I'm inspired by farmers in some of the most conservative parts of the world that are understanding that carbon farming is a way that they can turn into climate heroes. Mm-hmm. I'm inspired by some of the world's faith organizations, from the Patriarch Bartholomew to Pope Francis to the World Evangelical Alliance, who I serve as climate ambassador, who are bringing faith to the fight, because over 70% of people in this world, their values are formed by their faith. I'm really excited by the organization that I just joined this week as chief scientist, the Nature Conservancy, because they're working with NGOs and governments around the world to conserve 30% of nature by 2030. That's a huge goal, and it's only 9 years away. So when I hear about all the changes happening around the world, how 90% of new energy installed around the world during COVID in 2020 was clean energy, how much of that was in places where over 700 million people live in energy poverty, and it's transforming their lives today. When I hear stories like that, that's what gives me hope that change is possible, and that change will truly give us a better world.
Alok, can you share any thoughts you have on what is the most exciting thing, other than what you are personally doing to help save the planet?
Well, look, I mean, I think there are lots of exciting things going on, and that's the great thing. And by the way, I think these tree initiatives are absolutely fabulous. We, of course, also need to make sure that we stop deforestation, because trees obviously take some time to grow. I think in terms of the one thing that's come out of this discussion is that we have all agreed that actually, part of delivering net zero by the middle of the century is going to be driven by innovation in technologies, and us working collaboratively together, the private sector, the public sector, is going to be so important. And we've recently launched Mission Innovation 2, building on Mission Innovation 1. This is where governments sort of come together and put their minds and thoughts behind how we take forward and bring forward technologies and innovate on technologies even faster. And we launched Mission Innovation 2 earlier this month. 22 governments around the world coming together. And I'm very excited by that, because I think that shows that some of the technologies that we want to focus on are going to have the best brains around the world working on them. And from a UK perspective, one of the areas that we are co-leading on is going to be on power and clean hydrogen. And hydrogen, I think, green hydrogen particularly, I think is going to be one of the solutions that we are going to be looking for in terms of delivering that clean green future. So lots of great ideas. That's just one example. But I'm actually really buoyed up by the really positive discussion we've had today, and listening to all these that are entrepreneurs and scientists on the line.
Thank you so much. Sundar, is there anything you wanted to add to this conversation? What do you think is the most exciting thing happening?
Well, we spoke about many things. I would say there was an undercurrent of machine learning and AI. I would say that it's a secular trend which will affect a lot of things. It's very profound, but it'll end up playing an immense role in tackling climate change as well. And I think it's something I'm excited by, and I think all of us are working on it and can have a big impact.
And when you talk about that, an expression of AI for consumers is what you were talking about earlier in terms of figuring out the most eco-friendly way to get to a place, or is that one example?
That's one example, using AI to run our operations more efficiently, and then through Google Cloud, offering it to other people. Again, we're all using AI. For example, when we are trying to figure out geothermal to work, in addition to novel drilling techniques, et cetera, AI is fundamentally a key component of designing it to be better to work. So it's foundational, cuts across everything we do, and I think it's going to be an accelerant in terms of making progress on sustainability.
Thank you. Mark, what do you think? What's the most exciting thing happening that's going to save our planet that we haven't mentioned already? Or you can amplify.
Well, Trish, I think that people always overestimate what you can do in a year, but underestimate what you can do in a decade.
Yeah.
And certainly underestimate what we can do in a couple decades. And as a point of evidence of that, I just, look at Salesforce and Google. 2 decades ago, our companies basically did not exist. So today we're both very large companies with tens of thousands of employees and hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap, and it's an evidence of entrepreneurship and innovation and leadership. I think in a difficult problem like this, we're addressing things like green carbon, like trees, blue carbon, like oceans. We talked about that, brown carbon, the farms and the land itself, and also gray carbon. Tremendous new technology that is emerging to actually take the carbon out of the atmosphere and bring it and put it down into the ground. You look at companies in Switzerland, like Climeworks, or in Silicon Valley, Term Industrial. These are technologies we really could not have envisioned just 4 or 5 years ago. This is a moment where we need to empower, enable, and energize those ecopreneurs, because it is those ecopreneurs who are going to get us to where we want to go.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And Will, can you close this out?
Well, that's too big a task, but let me just say that, of course, I could say I'm very excited about the new satellites that we're creating, and that's certainly true. But I think my answer to your question of what I'm most excited about would actually be more terrestrial. 2 things. One is a lot of the biodiversity, the key biodiversity we care about saving, is in small areas of the planet, like coral reefs and mangroves and tropical rainforests. And so one project in that area that I'm excited about is people have been using our data to map all the world's coral reefs for the first time and check on ocean bleaching and if there's illegal fishing, and then help governments to act. Recently, Bangladesh, the country, established a marine protected area around some coral reefs that we found for them that they didn't even know existed. And so now we're mapping them, and they're creating a marine protected area around it. But perhaps the most mundane but important one is something that Catherine said, which is agriculture. Food and agriculture is I think agriculture is an environmental keystone. If you do precision agriculture, you can help 3 things at once: healthy food and diets to feed everyone. It's a carbon sink because the soil sequesters carbon, and it helps reduce pressure on deforestation, which is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And so it helps with all 3 of those things together. So actually, food is ironically the simplest and most important change that I think we need to make the planet this keystone to all these environmental pieces. So that's the thing I'm most excited about. And it's been a pleasure to chat to everyone here today. Thank you, Trish, for all your questions.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure to meet you all. And I hope we meet again. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Well, terrific. Thanks so much, Trish, and Will, for organizing, and Catherine, hello, Mark. Great to see all of you.